So, you've decided you want to play the coolest tabletop war game made by Games Workshop, Warhammer Age of Sigmar. You've perused the different armies to pick from and picked out the one that speaks to you the most. But now you face another big question. Which models should you get for said army? Oftentimes, there are a ton of options, making it easy to get overwhelmed. And to have a well-rounded, powerful list, it often requires some amount of game knowledge. Even for people who don't see themselves as tryhards or hardcore tournament players, not wanting to have an ineffective army is a valid concern. It's not much fun to spend your money buying a model, then spending hours building and painting it, and then have to actually get an in-person game just to have it die and accomplish nothing, and you have the realization of, oh wait, this unit's trash. Now this video won't be me going through every war scroll in the game. I simply couldn't do that in a reasonable amount of time. But instead I'll be going over generally what makes a unit good, and how you can assess this yourself, along with other new player tips for list building. To understand what makes a unit good, the main concept you'll want to understand is a unit's role, meaning what is its purpose in-game, and why you're putting the unit in your list. Although this isn't going to be something that is explicitly spelled out for you in the rules. Instead, many of these unit roles are colloquialisms made up by the community, or borrowed from real-life warfare terminology to quickly describe the main important roles that exist. As such, this is a very nebulous topic that's not the easiest to talk about, so I want to set some ground rules so you have a better idea of how I'm using the definitions I use. Firstly, units can fill more than one role, and the way you use a unit, or their surrounding list, can change a unit's role, such as reinforcing a unit to make them a larger threat, or certain battle formations can give a unit a significant benefit. 2. Not all units will cleanly fit into specific categories, or are just generally good rather than fitting into a specific role. If you play an especially weird army that doesn't fit the norm of what a prototypical army looks like, such as Sons of Behemoth, this is especially true. And while units don't necessarily need to fit into a predetermined role to be good, there is a good reason that these archetypes exist. Most of the time when assessing your options, trying to figure out generally what space a unit fills in the unit role canon, and its efficiency at that job is a good way to evaluate its strength on the table, especially when you're new to an army. Additionally, not all armies have access to every kind of unit, and there's no hard amount of each unit you should bring. The unique asymmetrical gameplay of Age of Sigmar leads to many different styles of armies that can all be successful. Next, you may think I'm wrong and disagree with the exact definitions I give, and the way I categorize things. However, I've probably spent over 1,000 hours playing Age of Sigmar over multiple editions, and have spent a lot of time interacting with other players, both new and more experienced than me. And in my opinion, this is simply the way I believe I can best describe this nebulous topic to players who have no baseline for this kind of terminology. I'll also be giving a lot of examples of units that fill specific roles to give you a better understanding. However, given the fact that rules change all the time for this game, it's entirely possible that the rules I show you on screen no longer match what the game looks like by the time you're watching this video. And lastly, if you're a super casual player who just paints the models you think look the coolest and just don't care about this kind of stuff, well then this video isn't really for you, and I wish I could experience the same kind of carefree mindset you do. This video goes on the assumption you want to build a well-rounded, powerful army that can put up a fight against most lists. But that's enough particulars, let's get to the different unit roles. Starting off, let's talk about the most straightforward unit role: hammers. Simply put, a hammer unit is a unit whose job is to do damage. A lot of damage. This is useful to have in your army since it's pretty hard for the opponent to score points if they don't have anything left on the table to score points with. For most armies, their main hammer unit's damage will come in the form of melee damage, as for the most part a lot of shooting units' damage isn't enough on its own and is more of supplemental damage to assist melee damage dealers. And in an ideal scenario, a hammer unit should be able to consistently destroy a target in a single combat phase if possible. For example, let's look at good old Stormcast Annihilators with Meteoric Grandhammers. A reinforced unit of them will do about 26 damage to a 4-up save. which is enough to lift many other hammer units of a similar amount of points in one activation. So they at the very least check the box of dealing solid damage. By the way, if you ever want to do your own damage calculations for your units, the absolute best go-to tool is AOS Stats Hammer V4. It's a great way to get some perspective over what you should expect to get out of your own units in-game, and factor any buffs you plan on giving them. You can even compare the effectiveness of different units on a per-point basis, which is a great way to help gauge the value of your points spent. But getting back to hammers, while a hammer's job is to do damage, their other stats are also worth mulling over. Movement often being the next important statistic you should consider, as if the hammer has no way to get to their target, then it doesn't really matter how much damage they do. It's like being a well-endowed incel. You may have all the tools to get the job done, but good luck putting them to any use. Like those annihilators I mentioned are extremely slow with only 4-inch movement, which means that it'll likely take multiple turns to get to a specific enemy unit, or worse, they'll never get to kill anything, as they either get shot off the board or simply cleared by enemy hammers, since they also suffer from being frail for their points. This reason is why currently it's a lot more popular to bring faster damage dealers, which are often cavalry units. For Stormcast, this would be units like Dracothian Guard, Evocators on Dracolines, who all have a movement of at least 10 inches. Some units are able to get around their slow-to-average movement by having an amazing delivery mechanism, like getting a 3d6 charge, or run-and-charge effects from other units in their army. But if a hammer lacks any real delivery mechanism, or the delivery mechanism is not worth the effort, you'll want to consider your other options. Don't fall into the trap of overinvesting in a garbage unit to try to make them playable. Like, yes, hypothetically you could bring both a Lord Imperatant and Gavriel Sureheart to semi-consistently allow Annihilators to make a charge after landing 9 inches away from the heavens. But do you really want to spend 300 points and 2 drops worth of heroes when you can spend less on a better unit? Absolutely not. And the advice of not overinvesting goes for all units, not just hammers. The other thing to keep in mind is a hammer's durability. While it's usually nice to have something that can take a bit of a beating like Stormcast and their 3-up save, this often comes with a bit of an extra cost and points value. And given the fact that some hammers can kill practically anything they swing at, it may not matter as much if you have a 3-up save or a 5-up save in some matchups. So hammer units that are frail but significantly cheaper to put in your lists have their own use case, and are often referred to as glass hammers or glass cannons. Although admittedly, I don't find this distinction too useful, as most armies don't have the luxury of having multiple different efficient hammers with varying levels of durability. Most armies just have to work with what they have. And for the other hammer unit subtype, there are what are called assassins, scalpels, or sniper units if they're a ranged unit, which are hammer units that don't do as much damage as a more traditional hammer, but can apply that damage much more consistently through a particularly great delivery mechanism. For melee units, it's usually stupidly good movement tricks, combined with a low amount of good but very consistent attacks. Prosecutors are a great example of this, being able to drop down from the sky, or just move up the board with their 12-inch flying move, and usually make it in with a 3d6 charge, and relatively small physical footprint, meaning they can take out a small key target when necessary. And when it comes to dedicated shooting units, the absolute best units have a range of at least 18 inches. Anything with a shorter range isn't necessarily bad, but it often means they have to get dangerously close to the opponent to even get a shot in, as they are usually in range to get countercharged in your turn, or just regularly charged in the opponent's turn, even if the unit being shot at has bad movement. If your army has anything with 18-inch reach shooting and decent damage output, then there is a good chance they are at the very least worth considering. The next unit role you'll often see are support units. Their main job is to increase the value you get out of your other units by making them better. When assessing your support units, the main things you should be thinking about are how powerful their supportive ability is, how consistent it is, and is it worth the price? Price not only being their points cost, but also, since most support units are also heroes, you'll need to consider which units they can take in their regiment. Regiment options for heroes can practically not matter at all if you play an army like Sylvaneth, where basically any unit can go with any other unit, or matter a ton if you play Stormcast, where you get screwed a million times over by keyword nonsense and are forced to play list-building Jenga. So even if a hero is fine on its own, if it can't bring your other good units, it probably gets passed on. Especially since while you can technically bring units outside of a regiment in the form of auxiliary units, this is seemingly by design a losing strategy and an absolute trap for new players. My best advice would be to pretend this option doesn't even exist. Also, don't forget, most of the time adding another hero to your list means you'll be adding another regiment to your army, meaning you'll have more to deploy at the beginning of the game, and that you'll have a lower chance of dictating who goes first in the first battle round, and the flow of the game will be in your opponent's hands, which is a lot of power to be handing over. Luckily, more often than not, your army will have access to some kind of cheap wizard or priest, and simply having one of those keywords on a support unit can be enough to validate their existence, since they can use whatever cool spell, prayer, or manifestation lures your army has access to. And some of the better options will have an additional great ability. Take the Slaughter Priest, for example. He generates Blood Tithe, which is an extremely valuable resource for Blades of Corn, and is one of the few sources the army has for unbinding enemy spells, making him very enticing. Although, of course, not all support heroes are magic-based, and unfortunately, a lot of the ones that aren't are questionable when it comes to viability. Some of them, like the Clawlord on Nobbies for Skaven, have bonuses that are so unimpactful that there's almost no points value that make them compelling to bring in a list. However, this isn't always the case. The Knight Vexillor really is a standout in his tier, and I know some people might be sick of all the Stormcast examples, but they really do have a lot of great prototypical unit options. Going through our list of things to check, for abilities, he brings healing, which is a very rare resource in Stormcast. He is reliable as his healing happens in both turns, and has a decent range. And even if your army is at full health, he still hands out an objective control buff as well. And for his cost, he is actually rather cheap and can be brought into another hero's regiment, meaning he won't increase your drops. He's just a great unit overall. And even though most support units are smaller heroes, that's not always the case. Sometimes there'll be a weird band of dudes like Gabapalooza or the Plague Pack, or there'll be a much larger hero. Although, for the extremely expensive ones, they usually need to have some amount of killing power or some other incredible standout quality, usually meaning they fill a secondary role as well. With that, now both hammers and support units have been covered, although now we face a big issue. While you really want to be able to send in your hammer into your opponent's army to kill everything, the opponent can do the exact same thing to you, and that's clearly just not fair. So, how can you protect your stuff from your opponent? Well, there are two main ways to go about this. The most common way is to bring what's called a screen, which is a less valuable, inexpensive unit that can protect your more important units by acting as a physical barrier that your opponent will have to kill first, usually meaning that when it rolls around to your turn, you get the more favorable combat. Now, there are a few things you're looking for in a screen unit. To start, above all, they need to be cheap, since the whole point of a screen is so that you have something you can afford to lose instead of losing something of real value. Additionally, it's arguably the norm that screens should also have some kind of other compelling benefit, besides being a bunch of cheap dudes. If you look at a unit like Carrick Acolytes, they check the first box of being cheap, but beyond that, they barely do anything meaningful, and usually lose most fights against other screens due to their particularly poor stats. So currently, they're spending more time on the shelf. On the flip side, screens may not be your only means of defensive measure. Some armies have exceptionally durable units in the form of anvils, which are units that have such amazing durability that they can even take a punch from most enemy hammers and live to tell the tale. So, what makes a unit a good anvil? Well, having a good armor save is simply never enough. There are hammers out there that can get to rend 3 on their attacks, or throw out mortal damage that goes straight through any base armor save. For a normal anvil unit to be good, they usually need good armor on top of other defensive capabilities. Like Blight Kings. They have a 3-up save and a 5-up ward, and can be made -1 to be wounded with their Faction's Unlimited spell. Additionally, having at least decent damage output is something you'll probably want to have. Thankfully for your anvils, many cavalry-based hammer units heavily rely on some kind of damage bonus when they charge, so they are often bad at long, grindy combats. And anvils that get their durability from other sources rather than good regular armor are often called tar pit units, which instead get their durability from having plenty of health, often applying debuffs to enemy attacks, and have some kind of recursion, often making it an unfavorable combat for hammers to get stuck into. The classic example of this has pretty much always been Tzeentch Horrors, and I'd say that still holds true this edition, due to the fact that Disciples of Tzeentch have very doable ways to make most incoming attacks both -1 to hit and wound. Sure, Horrors may have unimpressive damage output, but it should buy the rest of the army enough time to score points and whittle down whatever enemies got wrapped up in the Horror tar pit. And lastly, there are fast anvils, usually called pinning units. The main benefit of an anvil being mobile is that instead of waiting for your opponents to get stuck in a suboptimal combat, you can make the choice for them, which can keep them away from objectives or prevent them from accomplishing battle tactics. Obviously, locking enemies in combat doesn't exactly work so well against armies who can just retreat and still charge, or against units with particularly great damage output, but not all armies have that privilege. The next unit role is a bit more open-ended, but it's what's called a utility unit, which I would describe to be a unit that brings one or more interesting unique effects that are otherwise uncommon in its army. Most of the time, utility units also fill one of the previously mentioned roles. Pure utility units are actually pretty rare. A very common type of utility you'll encounter are bodyguard units, which provide some kind of protection for friendly nearby heroes, like Graveguard and Sourceguard, who hand out and gain a 5-up ward while by their hero. The other more common kind of utility is a unit to help complete battle tactics, as with the most recent edition of the game, and the current General's Handbook, battle tactics have been made to be very difficult. Even the most skilled players are usually not scoring 5 out of 5 tactics every game, so having some idiots who can run around and do tactics is pretty great. Looking at the current set of battle tactics as of recording, one of the biggest challenges armies face is consistently getting a tactic on turn 1, since most of the time there are only at most 2 reasonable tactics to do that don't rely on your opponent. Either seize the center, which requires 2 friendly units in the middle of the board and out of combat, or take the flanks, where you need 2 units on the short board edges and at least partially outside friendly territory and not set up that turn. So if you want to have the ability to score a turn 1 tactic consistently, regardless of battle plan, you'll want 2 mobile units that don't need to teleport, specifically 9-inch movement or better, since it means that on many battle plans where you start 9 inches away from outside your territory, as long as you get a run roll of at least 1, you'll at the very least make it out of your territory for take the flanks. And for doing seize the center, the cheapness of the unit is important if you plan on playing it safe, as putting 2 big valuable units in the center of the board turn 1 is the stereotypical noob insta-lose strategy, since it opens you up to getting charged by your opponent. But also, if the opponent gets the double turn right after, they will once again most likely be able to continue their wave of destruction right into the center of your army, often meaning you have lost enough models where it's impossible to come back in a meaningful way. So when looking for battle tactic goobers, look for fast and cheap units in your army. In practice, this means that fast screens are especially enticing. Gryph-hounds are a prime illustration of this. They have that bare minimum 9-inch movement, which almost feels too perfect. They are obscenely cheap at 80 points. Most armies in the game don't even have units that cheap. And they come in a unit of 6, which can be stretched out to cover a 12-inch area. Although for certain armies, you might have to get a bit creative to get that turn 1 tactic. Like Plague Drones are a bit more pricey, but they are the most mobile thing in Nurgle, so are simply the best thing for getting tactics done. Especially since in the Affliction Cyst battle formation, they get to start anywhere on the battlefield before the game starts. The last bit of utility you should consider would be any unit that can meaningfully interact with your opponent during their turn. If there's one thing I want to hammer into your developing Warhammer brain, it's that more than ever, interactivity is important. On a fundamental level, being able to make your opponent's path to victory more difficult to navigate is one of the best ways to win, with battle tactics being increasingly difficult, but also the size of objectives becoming smaller compared to previous editions. One really interesting case of this right now would be Manfred, Mortarch of Night. He has a lot of cool stuff on his War Scroll that makes him amazing, but I want to focus on his signature ability, where he allows your units to redeploy into combat range of the opponent. This has so many implications, but mainly you can use it to stop your opponent from charging if they ever get remotely close to any of your units. Meaning they will have less movement options, they won't get any charge bonuses, or possibly won't be able to complete their battle tactic or reach a key objective, most likely stopping any great plans they had right in their tracks. So if your army has anything that can mess with your opponent in their turn, such as using magical intervention to cast a teleport spell in your opponent's turn, you are shooting yourself in the foot by not making use of those options. And with that, I'd say those would be what I would call the main 5 roles and their subcategories that people use to describe units. But what does all of this mean for you as a player? Well, a lot actually. The biggest thing is that you want to be thinking about these concepts during list building. Like I mentioned earlier, you want to have at the very least a vague plan for each and every unit. When looking at your own unit options, you should be thinking about what each unit in your army can do, and who can fill necessary roles best. For example, you should probably have a couple hammers in your army. Going through your army rules, you should pick out what units have compelling damage profiles, and use that handy website I mentioned earlier to work out how much damage each unit can expect to do, keeping in mind their ability to apply that damage and the other unique tools they bring to the mix. Now, of course, as I alluded to earlier, it may be the case that certain units that you own are just simply terrible in-game. It's just the simple truth that the internal balance of units in each army is far from perfect. Like, with their current War Scroll, I think GW's intent was that Mangler Squigs are supposed to go around and kill stuff, but I'm not even sure if there is a points value where they do that well. They die to basically anything, only having a 5-up save to protect themselves. They are inconsistent due to the fact that for some godforsaken reason, GW is still giving monsters D6 damage characteristic for their main attacks, and even on average, they're disappointing. This thing usually can't even kill your average unnamed Stormcast hero. It's laughably bad. However, for all of you players out there who have your own favorite bad pet unit, for now just don't overinvest on all the bad stuff, and focus on using your other cool units in your army. And maybe in a few months, once you've gotten your army fully painted, or in a year when new rules release, or even by the time you're watching this video, the Mangler Squig and all of his garbage tier friends will have their time in the sun. Warhammer is meant to be more of a long-term investment hobby, so don't worry too much about the now of it all. Another thing to keep in mind is even if you play an army who lacks specific unit roles, it's still useful to know about these unit archetypes. Such as if you play an army who lacks a great way to do a turn 1 tactic, or you don't want to run some cheap tactic goobers, then you'll logically need to compensate somehow. One strategy some armies are able to employ is to run a list where it's just a bunch of big value units crammed into a single regiment, so they can almost guarantee the choice of who goes first, and pass the burden of completing a turn 1 tactic onto their opponent. Most armies don't quite have the right tools to get down to a viable 1-drop list, but almost all armies can get down to 2 drops with the right planning. And that's pretty much all of the general list building advice I have to share. If you're interested in specific army advice, there are some great guides out there for the many armies that make up this game. And as time goes on, I'll be making more army guides for 4th edition army rules. And as always, huge thanks to everyone who has been a Patreon supporter, like Joseph Winters and the Hooded Stranger. The extra support means a lot to me, and helps me get out more videos, as Patreon usually ends up being just as large of a source of income as YouTube does. If you want to become a supporter yourself, feel free to check out the link below, but if you just want to help out the channel in another way, make sure to like and comment, or recommend the channel to your friends. The algorithm gods really like that kind of stuff. But that'll be it for me. If you're a new player, I hope this guide taught you something new, and that I'll see you in the next one.